I used to believe that family meant protection, that no matter how bad things got, my parents would always see me, hear me, believe me. But that illusion shattered the night my sister screamed that I had ruined her life, and they believed her. Not once did they ask for my side. They just stood there, cold, silent, and certain that I was the villain in their perfect little story. I packed my things without a word. There was no fight, no dramatic goodbye, just the quiet sound of the door closing behind me and the echo of a home that no longer wanted me. I disappeared from their world, and for a while, I let them think they'd won. But time has a cruel way of turning the tables. Because this morning, after years of silence, my phone lit up with 14 missed calls from the same people who swore they never wanted to see me again. Now they're desperate to find me, begging for help, saying they finally understand. What could have possibly changed? What made the people who destroyed me suddenly realize what I was worth? They thought I vanished out of weakness. But the truth is, I left to become someone they'd regret losing. And now, it's my turn to decide whether to answer those calls, or let them live with the silence they once gave me. Before everything fell apart, my life was simple, quiet, maybe even predictable, but it was mine. I lived in a small apartment just outside the city, filled with soft light, secondhand furniture, and the kind of peace that comes from building something on your own. Every morning, I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and watched the world wake up from my little balcony. It wasn't much, but it felt safe until safety became something I couldn't trust anymore. I worked as a freelance designer, pouring my energy into projects that gave me a sense of independence. My parents used to brag about me, the responsible one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, who always figured things out on her own. And then there was my sister, Lily. She was the golden one. Beautiful, impulsive, the center of every conversation. I loved her despite it all, maybe too much. Growing up, I was always the one cleaning up after her mistakes. The calls at midnight, the quiet apologies to our parents, the excuses I made for her when things went wrong.
I didn't mind then.
That's what sisters do, right? We protect each other. Or, at least, that's what I believed. But over time, something shifted. Lily's mistakes became heavier, darker. She'd spend money she didn't have, borrow from friends, disappear for days. My parents called it a phase. I called it denial. Every time I tried to warn them, they brushed me off. She just needs time, don't make things worse. It was easier for them to see me as the strong one, the fixer, than to face the truth about her. Still, I kept my distance, hoping she'd find her way. I had my own life to manage, my work, my friends, the quiet little world I had built. But the tension was always there, humming beneath the surface. Family dinners became uncomfortable silences. Every compliment I received seemed to make her glare a little colder. Every success of mine was treated like a personal attack. I tried to pretend it didn't bother me, but deep down, I felt it, that invisible crack forming between us, growing wider with every passing year. Then came the night that changed everything. I didn't know it yet, but it had been building for months. Little things I ignored, moments I should have paid attention to. The missing money from our parents' account. The way Lily avoided eye contact whenever the topic came up. My mother's sudden defensiveness whenever I asked questions. I thought they were just protecting her again like they always did. But what I didn't realize was that this time, she wasn't just lying to them. She was setting the stage for something much worse. That night, we were all at my parents' house, a rare family dinner, full of forced laughter and hollow conversation. Lily seemed jittery, too cheerful. I remember noticing her shaking hands as she poured the wine, the way her eyes darted toward me every few seconds. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was nervous about something she'd done. I had no idea that, within an hour, she'd turn everyone in that room against me. Looking back, I can still hear her voice, the way it cracked when she screamed my name, the accusation that froze the air in my lungs. The confusion, the disbelief on my parents' faces. The way everything I thought I knew about my family suddenly twisted into something unrecognizable. But that's getting ahead of myself. At that point, I still believed in forgiveness. In family. In second chances. I still believed that if I just kept being patient, kept doing the right thing, everything would work out. I had no idea that the people I loved most were about to teach me the most painful lesson of my life, that sometimes family isn't who protects you, it's who destroys you from the inside out. And when they did, I didn't fight back. Not yet. I simply walked away. Because revenge doesn't always start with anger. Sometimes it starts with silence, the kind that makes them wonder what you'll do next. For days after I left, I lived like a ghost. I answered no calls, ignored messages, and let the small comforts of my apartment keep me from unraveling entirely. I told myself time would blunt the hurt, that distance would make things smaller. But silence has its own noise. It amplified every memory, every glance, every moment I'd been dismissed. The ache wasn't only betrayal, it was the feeling of being erased by the people who once named me first. The proof came when I stopped looking for it. I was cleaning out a drawer I'd barely touched since the move, a box of old receipts and letters, when an envelope slid free with a soft whisper. Inside was a bank statement, not my parents', not mine, but Lily's name stamped across the top and a list of transactions that read like fingerprints. Withdrawals at odd hours, transfers to shadowy accounts, repeated payments to a number I didn't recognize. The numbers alone meant little until I matched the dates to moments I remembered. The night Lily borrowed money and swore she'd pay it back. The weekend she vanished with an excuse about a friend in trouble. Everything started to line up into a pattern I had been too kind to acknowledge. Then I found the messages. A thread buried under a standard messaging app, saved to drafts and never sent. The words weren't cruel at first, apologetic, pleading even, but there was a shift in tone deeper in the thread, a coldness that suggested calculation. Mentions of names I didn't know. References to things my parents had assumed were simple mistakes. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't a child spiraling or a series of poor decisions. This was a deliberate performance, and I had been given the role of scapegoat. I wanted to rage. I wanted to drive to their house and fling the evidence in front of them, to make them see the truth with the same clarity that had smacked me in the face. But part of me moved slower, with the measured patience of someone who had been underestimated her whole life. I knew, oddly, quietly, that yelling would only confirm the image they had of me, the dramatic, unstable daughter. If I screamed, they would clap the label onto me and bolt the lid. So I did the thing they never expected. I rebuilt myself in the silence. I took temp work, then longer contracts. I earned money quietly and deliberately, each invoice a small act of defiance. I learned to be invisible and efficient at the same time. I paid for a small, nondescript storage unit and began collecting documents, receipts, and anything that connected Lily to the web she'd spun. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't need applause. The work was its own validation. Every piece I collected felt like a small victory, a hotel receipt with Lily's signature, a bank transfer that matched one of the recurring withdrawals, a photograph from a night she had claimed to be elsewhere. My anger sharpened into focus. It stopped being about hurt and became about justice, a slow, deliberate force that pushed me forward. But revenge needs leverage, and leverage needed patience. I watched their social patterns like a scientist studying a specimen. My parents were creatures of habit. Sunday lunches, monthly charity donations, predictable generosity towards certain acquaintances. Lily, meanwhile, performed a different dance, public charm, private manipulation. She cultivated friends who would echo her words and defend her without thinking. She had learned which buttons to press. I started with small disruptions. A canceled delivery here, a quietly redirected reminder there. Nothing overt, nothing to call police or scandal, but enough to make them feel off balance. A missed reservation at a restaurant they loved. A double-booked appointment that left my mother stranded. They shrugged it off at first. People misplace things. Nobody suspects a woman who seems to have nothing to prove. And yet each tiny ripple created a crack. My parents began to complain about a streak of bad luck. They muttered about forgetfulness, about age perhaps. Lily, unruffled, offered solutions with the calmness of a stage manager. She leaned in to patch things up and, with each patch, stitched herself more tightly into their gratitude. I watched from the edges and cataloged their reactions like evidence. But I didn't limit myself to petty inconveniences. I had to make sure there was a path from small embarrassments to undeniable, painful truth. That required courage I hadn't known I carried. I began to contact people from Lily's past, friends she'd wronged, contractors she'd stiffed, bar owners who remembered her late-night fights. I sent polite messages, posing as someone trying to help a lost family in need. The responses trickled in, confirmations of debts, of lies, of patterns. Some replies were quick and angry. Others were careful, as if remembering something they'd preferred to forget. The first real break came when a landlord from a coastal town sent a scanned copy of a lease with Lily's signature and a row of overdue notices attached. The dates aligned perfectly with one of those mysterious transfers. It was a small paper, but it cut through the fog of their denials like a blade. I folded it into my folder and felt my chest loosen. This was real. This was verifiable. I started to place these pieces where they would matter. I learned what embarrasses people more than money: exposure. Public exposure is cruelty without blood. It shows them they were mistaken and that the world sees them as they are. I sketched plans for how to bring the truth into spaces they valued: the charity board where my mother volunteered, the country club where my father had his coffee, the neighborhood chat group that kept track of every garden party. The aim was not to humiliate for sport, but to make their complacency uncomfortable in a place they could not ignore. Still, there were moments when doubt gnawed at me. Revenge felt like a doubled mirror. Would the reflection of my actions make me less human? I sat with that question on sleepless nights and found, slowly, a hard answer. I would not become them. My goal was not cruelty. It was reclamation. I wanted them to see the consequences of their choices, not to be destroyed by me, but to be confronted with the truth they had refused to see. As I set the plan into motion, cracks deepened faster than I expected. A friend of my mother's forwarded an email to me after a small, unrelated neighborhood scandal. It contained a photograph, candid, grainy, of Lily at an event she had claimed she'd never attended. The image was unsigned, but the timestamp confirmed she had lied. My parents received it as gossip at first, then as a fact they could not easily dismiss. The photograph created a gravity that the paper receipts hadn't quite managed. The 14 calls came later, not the panic calls of the morning that would rock their world, but test calls. The first was from my cousin, awkward and probing, asking if I was all right. The second was from a neighbor, sotto voce, checking in. The calls multiplied into a web of concerned voices. Each voicemail was a small fence trying to contain the growing chaos. They were attempting to salvage what they could without naming the reason, afraid perhaps of what naming would reveal. When my mother finally left a message, her voice split on the edges. It sounded like someone holding the pieces of their life and wondering which bit belonged to whom. I didn't answer. I let the calls stack like unanswered prayers. I watched from a distance as their world began to tilt. The community's whispers sharpened into questions. People who had once praised my sister for her charm started trading stories. Little discrepancies became a chorus. But the real turning point wasn't the calls. It was the moment I realized they were scrambling not to find the truth, but to patch the image they had spun for years. They were more concerned with the narrative than the facts. That realization hardened something in me. Their remorse, when it came, would be performative unless it was forced into honesty. So, I tightened the net. I shared documents with a trusted contact in a local community group, the kind that documented neighborhood events and charitable donations. I sent an anonymous tip to someone who wrote for a small local newsletter. Nothing salacious, only the facts, the receipts, the dates. My aim was simple: make the truth live where the image of perfection had flourished. As the net closed, their calls turned desperate. My parents oscillated between contrition and anger in voice messages I refused to hear. Lily's friends messaged me with denial and pleas. One friend warned that exposing this would ruin lives. Another hinted at secrets that made my stomach drop. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer about reclaiming my dignity. It was about whether the truth would be loud enough to prevent Lily from doing to someone else what she'd done to me. I stood at the edge of the plan like someone about to step off a cliff, not because I lacked courage, but because the fall meant irreversible change. I could walk back into the silence and let the family keep its illusions, or I could pull the thread and watch the whole tapestry unravel. I chose to pull. And as I hit send on the first anonymous message that compiled everything, the receipts, the photos, the corroborations, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, a fierce, cold clarity. The die was cast. I would not be silent any longer. But pulling that thread only opened a new question. Would exposing the truth make them face what they'd done, or just make me the villain in a newer, louder story? The night of the gala felt like the last page of a book I'd been writing in secret. The hall glittered with chandeliers and polite laughter, people in gowns and suits moving like actors in a play where everything was rehearsed and nothing was true. My parents were at the center of it all, my mother smiling with that practiced generosity that had always masked the sharp edges beneath, my father nodding at each compliment like a man who had never been taught to ask questions. Lily floated near them, perfect in a way that made me want to look away. I had planned for this moment in increments. The anonymous emails, the leaked receipts, the quiet confirmations from people who had once been willing to forget. But planning is one thing, and watching it actually unfold is another. I sat in the back of the hall, a small, anonymous presence among hundreds, and felt the strange sensation of being both invisible and utterly exposed. My throat was tight. My hands did not shake, not because I was calm, but because the cold focus had taken over. Everything else had narrowed to a single line of consequence. When the program reached the charity segment that my mother chaired, the room settled. A projector hummed to life. I felt it in my ribs, a small animal, fierce and sure. The screen brightened and, instead of the usual montage of smiling beneficiaries, the slideshow opened with a scanned bank transfer, a hotel receipt, a grainy photograph of Lily at an event she'd said she'd missed. My heart hammered as each document slid onto the screen, each with dates and annotations that left no comfortable space for excuses. There was a ripple of confusion at first, like the slow spread of cold water across a table. People shifted, whispering, glancing at one another. My mother's smile faltered just enough for me to see it as a crack in plaster. My father's jaw tightened. Lily's face drained of color into something like calculation, an instant performance of disbelief that only drew the room's eyes harder toward her. As the evidence stacked on the screen, the tone in the hall shifted from curiosity to recognition. One by one, the receipts matched stories I had once told myself were small, inconsequential things. The pattern emerged not as accusation, but as undeniable logic. My chest loosened in a way that felt almost like breath. This was the part one had worked for. Not to shame, exactly, but to stop the rotation of their comfortable lies by proving that those lies could not hold up under light. Then the name appeared. Not mine, not anonymous anymore. My name, clear, simple, tagged to the dossier that had been circulating in whispers for weeks. Somewhere in the back someone murmured that the documents had been sent by an anonymous source, but with my name attached, the room's focus sharpened into a single question. Who had the courage to make this public? Eyes turned toward the table where my parents sat like shipwreck survivors who had just realized the water was rising. My mother's hands trembled on the program. My father's face, usually unreadable, unfolded into a map of small defeats. Lily's hands clenched beneath the table. For a sliver of a moment, I felt pity for them, the odd, bitter kind that tastes like metal, before it was swallowed by the finality of what I had chosen to do. I had imagined their reactions 1,000 times in the quiet, rehearsing each emotion for maximum effect. But the truth was purer than any rehearsal. The room's hum snapped into a silence that was almost sacred. People leaned forward. Phones came out, flashes quick and bright, not for the smiling beneficiaries, but for the evidence that the glitter could not wash away. Someone stood to speak. The voice was officious, careful. It read out the facts without flourish. The charity's board chair couched it in concern, then in disbelief. Friends of my family murmured about the impossibility. The narrative they immediately wanted was one that would restore normalcy, an explanation that would neatly fold the scandal back into the shape of the life they preferred. But facts don't tidy themselves. Across from me, a woman I recognized from my mother's circle, polished, influential, folded her hands and whispered to a man whose face I'd seen at every society luncheon. Their eyes flicked to my mother as if they were trying to gauge whether she would survive the fall or take them with her. I felt a small, vengeful satisfaction at the discomfort visible on those faces. This was not about trophies or victory laps. This was about piercing the bubble they lived inside. Then, abruptly, a commotion near the front. Lily leaped from her seat as if propelled, words spilling in a flood that tried to be reason but read instead as defense. Her friends rose then, reflexively protective, their gestures small and frantic. But the documents had teeth. People began to ask the quiet question none of us had been allowed to say at home. If this could happen here, what else had been hidden? My phone vibrated in my pocket. I had set it to record the event anonymously, a safety I did not need but wanted. I glanced at the screen and thought of the years I'd spent being the quiet one, fixing, smoothing, absorbing. The irony burned me. I had spent my life giving every part of myself to keep their picture-perfect world intact. Now I watched that picture crack, and rather than celebrate in a theatrical way, I felt something more akin to a release. By the time the board adjourned into whispered meetings in corners, the damage was done. Conversations that had once been gentle and decorative turned sharp-edged. A few people left the hall immediately, their faces pale with the knowledge that they had been inadvertently complicit in a myth. Others stayed, eyes hunting for my parents' reactions, for Lily's explanation, for the moment where truth and performance collided. My phone buzzed again, a single voicemail notification from my mother. I could have played it there in the hall, let everyone hear the tremor of her voice. I could have stood up and walked to their table and revealed everything. Instead, I stayed seated, watching the aftermath as though I were reading the final chapter of a book and savoring the cadence. Outside the building, a small cluster of reporters had gathered. The scent of scandal pricked at the air like rain before a storm. I had fed the newsletter the documents. I had tipped the local writer. But I had not expected the reach to grow so fast, to pull in the neighborhood gossip mills and turn private deception into public consequence. My plan had been patience. The universe had provided speed. As guests filed out, glances that would have once been casual became knives. My mother avoided my eye. My father's steps were heavy and ungainly. Lily's friends flanked her like a shield that had already begun to dent. I felt the calculation in their movements, the attempt to salvage dignity, where facts had no sympathy left to offer. When the last of the guests left and the chandeliers dimmed, I walked out into the chill night air that felt, for the first time in a long while, like something I owned. My phone vibrated again, this time a string of missed calls, a map of names that had once been comfortable and now reached for me. I let it continue to buzz. I had done what I had set out to do. The truth was out, and the silence I had chosen was no longer empty, but full of consequence. I stood on the curb and watched my parents' car pull away, slower than usual, a vehicle carrying people who had to confront what their choices had cost them. In that moment, something shifted. I had not planned what would come next. The public fallout, the private apologies, the irreversible fractures. I had only planned this, to make them see. As the taillights faded, I felt a cold, clear conclusion settle into me, and a single thought rose like a tide. I had made them face themselves. But facing them was only the beginning. When the dust finally settled, I thought I'd feel free. Lighter. Vindicated. But standing there, watching the pieces of my plan fall into place, I realized something no one tells you about revenge. It doesn't end when the other person breaks. It ends when you decide to stop holding on. They lost everything that night. Their lies, their pride, their perfect little facade, all gone. The people who once whispered behind my back now turned their eyes toward them. I should have felt satisfied. After all, I'd been humiliated, betrayed, torn apart. I had every right to strike back. And I did. Ruthlessly. Strategically. Completely. But when I saw the shock in their eyes, the disbelief, the shame, I didn't feel the victory I'd imagined. I felt empty. like I had become the very storm that once destroyed me. For months, I'd been so consumed with exposing them that I forgot what peace even felt like. My life had turned into a chessboard of moves and countermoves, and I didn't know how to live without the game. In the days that followed, people called me brave. Some said I was cruel. Others said I did what anyone else would have done. But none of them knew what it was like to lie awake at night replaying every moment, wondering if I'd gone too far or not far enough. I tried to move on. I really did. I changed my number, left the city, started over. Yet, no matter how far I went, their faces haunted me. Because revenge doesn't erase what happened. It just mirrors it back in a darker light. Still, part of me needed to see it through to the end. I needed them to understand what they'd done, to face the consequences they thought they'd escaped. And in a twisted way, they did. I heard later that their world never fully recovered. The cracks I made stayed, quietly spreading through everything they touched. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about reputation anymore. It was about power, reclaiming mine after they took it away. And for a brief moment, I had it. Completely. That feeling, it's intoxicating, but dangerous. Because once you taste that kind of control, it's hard to let go. There's this moment no one talks about, the quiet after the chaos. When everyone else moves on, and you're left alone with what you've done. That's when the real reckoning begins. I started asking myself, did I get justice or just revenge? Were they really the only ones who deserved to suffer? Or did I drag parts of myself into the fire with them? I think about that night sometimes, how everything I'd planned came together perfectly. I remember the adrenaline, the fear, the thrill. And then the silence. That sharp, hollow quiet that follows destruction. That's when I realized revenge doesn't heal you, it changes you. It forces you to look at the parts of yourself capable of cruelty, of calculation, of darkness, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. But I'll tell you this, despite everything, I don't regret it. Not fully. Because that chapter taught me something no amount of peace ever could. It taught me what it means to stand up for myself, even when my voice shakes. It taught me that sometimes the only way out of the fire is to walk through it. The people who hurt me, they'll never forget what I did. And neither will I. Because revenge leaves marks on everyone involved. Theirs were visible. Mine were invisible, but deeper. Now, when people ask me if it was worth it, I pause. Because the truth isn't simple. I didn't win or lose, I changed. I became someone who refuses to be silenced again. Someone who knows what she's capable of, for better or worse. If you've ever been betrayed, you know the feeling, the burn in your chest, the questions that never stop spinning. You think revenge will quiet them, but it doesn't. It just replaces one kind of pain with another. And yet, maybe that's part of healing too. Maybe sometimes you need to break the cycle before it breaks you. I don't tell this story to glorify what I did. I tell it because it's real. Because every person watching this has a limit, a line they pray no one ever pushes them past. I crossed mine and I survived it. Barely. But I did. So, if you're listening to this, if you've ever been betrayed, belittled, or broken, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do if you had the chance to make it right? Would you take it no matter the cost? Because that's the thing about revenge. It doesn't just test your enemies, it tests you. And sometimes, the hardest part isn't watching them fall. It's realizing you had to become your own monster to make it happen. So tell me, when justice fails and revenge calls your name, would you answer?